Were there any questions about last week's material before we move into new material?
No, we're good. Thank you.
All right, so we left off last week in the section on talking about obstacles to meditation. We covered the five, what are called the five hindrances, the sort of the historical list of five obstacles that, all meditators essentially have to deal with in order to progress toward calm, focused attention over time. And then there's a different list of obstacles, a different set of obstacles. And these relate to what what motivates distraction. We talked about, different kinds of distraction in a more general sense, like distractions that are connected to excitement, distractions that are connected to dullness, etc. Um, but then we can also talk about what states of mind are the reason that the mind tends to easily wander away from the intended object, whatever the intended object of a given session of meditation might be. And so these are generally what are called negative states of mind. And here, negative, the meaning of negative is twofold. And it is the same meaning when the word negative is used in just about any context in Buddhism, which is one, that it's a state of mind that when it is present in the mind of a person, then that person at that time, their mind is agitated, is disturbed, is not peaceful, is not contented. Um, and then simultaneously with that, when that is arising in their mind, the actions that they're likely to engage in are more likely to be actions that harm other people. When a person is experiencing uh, great contentment, great ease, great peace of mind, then at that moment, they're very unlikely to raise their voice in anger, to steal something, to be physically aggressive, to be violent, to engage in any kind of actions that are harmful because in their own mind, they are experiencing a sense of contentment, a sense of joy, a sense of peace, a sense of ease. But when the mind is agitated, when the mind is disturbed, that is when a person is in danger, more, a greater danger of engaging in those sorts of destructive actions as it relates to other people. So a negative state of mind has those two qualities to it. It agitates the mind of the person experiencing it as it's arising, and then whatever actions they might engage in that are influenced by that state are much more likely to be harmful to people around that person. And so, in terms of meditation, when we are sitting down to engage in a session of meditation, because of habituation to these negative states of mind, they often can arise and and generate distracting thoughts and feelings that are very tend to be very emotionally charged. And because they're very emotionally charged, we easily move away from the intended object toward these other objects that are not the intended object. So the first of this list of afflicted or negative states of mind is what's called attachment. Attachment is, in this context, one of the what are called the three root delusions, or sometimes the three poisons. And attachment, like all of these quote unquote negative states of mind, has a specific meaning, a specific definition. So attachment is a way of perceiving, a way of relating that observes something outside of oneself, some phenomena, could be another person, could be an object, like an inanimate object, a food, could be an experience or a circumstance, like being able to go to, have some sort of pleasant activity to engage in, or something that a person desires, like, a promotion or some kind of circumstance in their life. So, really, anything that's outside of oneself that for that person has a quality of appearing to that person as being pleasant, being enjoyable, being something that they desire, that they are interested in being in contact with. Um, and this mind that is observing this object that is pleasant to that person may not be pleasant to another person, but for that person, they observe it to be pleasant. They observe it to be something that they desire. They are relating to it in an exaggerated way, not in a balanced way. So for it to be attachment, it isn't just, oh, I enjoy this activity, or I find this to be something that is, pleasant to me, to my mind. It's an exaggerated way of relating to that which is pleasant, but in a way where the person feels that in order for them to be happy, they need to be in contact with that object. They need to possess it. They need to be engaging with it. It needs to be part of their experience. And the person would feel, if they were to be separated from that pleasant object, that necessarily they would feel as though they would be suffering. That if you took that away from them, they would feel as though they had no choice but to have that be a painful experience. So, this mind, the mind of attachment, this way of relating to things that are pleasant, is pretty much ubiquitous among ordinary people. It isn't something that only some people have. People may have it, to a greater or lesser degree, but it's just part of the human condition. Um, it's, essentially unavoidable that we are going to observe things that are pleasant, and we're going to have this exaggerated way of relating to them. And so, in our meditation practice, when we are, you know, trying to focus our mind on a chosen object that, and maybe we're doing, there's a certain amount of repetition that's involved in that process. There's a certain amount of um, moving the mind away from stimulation, things that are in our environment that are engaging with our senses. So the mind can certainly at that time crave these objects of attachment. The mind can easily kind of cause us to daydream about these objects, whatever for a particular person serves as an object of attachment. Extremely common to then wish for, being in contact with these things. And so the more the mind is habituated to attachment, the more likely it is that we will find ourselves daydreaming about objects of attachment when we're trying to meditate. So then the second one on this list is anger. Um, so anger is motivated by what's called aversion. So aversion and attachment are kind of two ends of one spectrum of how we relate to things that are outside of ourselves. And with attachment, we're relating to things that we find enjoyable. When aversion is arising, we are relating to something that we find unpleasant, that we wish to be separated from. So, in a way, it's the opposite way of being in relation to a positive object. We, when someone says or does something unkind to us, we often react with anger because we don't wish to be treated that way. We don't wish to have that experience. And again, with anger that arises on the basis of aversion, there's an aspect of an exaggerated mind. It isn't a balanced mind that just, sees that this is a challenge, that this is something that isn't ideal, but that, can also recognize that maybe it's unavoidable or can recognize that there are some useful aspects to learning to relate to this object of aversion in a balanced way. Instead, it's a mind like the mind of attachment. It is a mind that sees that situation as being entirely negative. The mind of attachment exaggerates the pleasant or positive qualities and sees the object of attachment as being entirely pleasant. The mind of aversion sees the unpleasant object as entirely negative. And there's no space, no room in the mind to observe it in a balanced way. And so we react with, just wanting to get rid of it, just wanting to be separated from it, wanting to forcibly remove it from our experience. And then that way of relating to it can certainly give rise to an angry mind, a mind that has no tolerance for the experience of things that are challenging. And of course, here again, when we are trying to cultivate a practice in our lives, we experience frustrations, difficulties, obstacles, and as the mind becomes more subtle, in meditation, again, the mind might replay these unpleasant, because again, that emotionally charged aspect. We're very motivated to seek out objects of attachment, and we're very motivated to separate ourselves from objects of aversion. And because of that emotional charge, then we are swayed from the intended object, very easily when the mind is replaying something that happened earlier that day, the day before, and we just kind of can't let it go. We're just perseverating on something that happened that was aversive, to our mind because we haven't learned how to be balanced about how we're relating to things, either that are pleasant or unpleasant. Um, so I'll just go through the list and then I'll pause and we'll go back for any questions that there might be. The third then is pride. And here, oftentimes it'll be phrased as deluded pride, because it doesn't necessarily mean taking pride, in terms of like feeling good about an accomplishment that a person had, feeling like something was well done. That's okay. It's perfectly reasonable to have a sense of feeling good about one's accomplishments. Deluded pride is a comparative mind. It is an attitude where, on the basis of feeling that one self has a skill or an ability, some sort of talent, some capacity, then that makes a person superior to either lots of other people or a specific person. It's a mind that compares oneself with others on the basis of the qualities that a person thinks that they possess. Um, and, we may or may not be accurately judging our own qualities. We know that sometimes we think that we're better at things than we actually are. But we could be, we could be very clearly, it could be that we are excellent at a particular thing. Now, we may be incredibly skilled as a heart surgeon or an accountant, or we may be able to, or as an athlete, or, whatever it might be. And that's fine. So it doesn't really matter if we're appraising our qualities accurately or not. What matters is that we compare ourselves to people who we perceive as not having those qualities, and we think that I am better than someone else because I have this quality and they lack this quality. Um, so this kind of mind can be, in terms of how it is an obstacle for our practice, mainly it's in relation to the kind of receptivity that we need to have in order to progress on the path. We might think, oh, I've already learned this. I already know this. I don't need to think about this anymore. I've already mastered this. Um, and so there's a humility that's important to cultivate for our spiritual lives. Um, and we might cut ourselves off from putting time and putting energy and putting effort into our practice if we are really habituated into, um, you know, thinking in this deludedly prideful way. Um, and then, of course, it also is something that can kind of co-opt our spiritual practice as well. This habit, this tendency, this habit, because the whole point of our spiritual practice is not to accumulate, facts and, being able to rattle off, what are the six of this and the eight of that, or the names of different lineage masters and whatever. The purpose is to genuinely transform our own minds to become, more compassionate, more patient, more wise, more generous, more ethical, and so on, gradually over time, so that we are beneficial for other sentient beings. Uh, and so the habit of deluded pride can kind of co-opt this process by causing us to think about, how amazing it is that I'm doing this practice. Like, oh, I must be such an amazing person because I'm spending, other people are not doing this, but I am doing this. So they're not as good as me. I'm better than they are. That way of thinking is going to totally derail the whole point of, what it is that we're trying to accomplish. Okay, and then the fourth is jealousy or envy, which is another comparative mind, a mind that wishes to appropriate what other people have. Um, so, so this is a mind that is blocked from rejoicing in the good fortune that other people have. Um, you know, People we know might get a raise, or they might be able to get a new house or a new car, or they get a relationship that makes them more fulfilled. Um, and instead of responding to that from our side with rejoicing in their good fortune, we just think, well, why not me? Why didn't this happen to me? I wish I had that. And instead of them, as if, as if that way of thinking would actually bring something to oneself, right? Instead of they were the ones that did the hard work, put in the time, the energy to get the raise. Um, and we kind of think, well, why didn't that happen to me? As if we could kind of take what they accomplished and experience it ourselves. Um, so it's a kind of a scarcity mindset, kind of a very diluted way of um, thinking, and it's also, in a way, it has a flavor of also being angry, thinking that this shouldn't have been experienced by this person, but but it should have been my experience, and so again, we are surrounded, right, by people that we know or people that we hear about having all kinds of good fortune. And so, if we can't develop a habit, a tendency to rejoice in that good fortune, then again, when we're trying to, cultivate positive qualities in meditation, the mind is going to sort of be playing these stories of, I can't believe that, this person was able to get this and it didn't happen to me. So it's kind of a tight, miserable, unhappy mind that we are going to be stuck with if we can't reverse that habit and actually just learn to rejoice that other people were able to experience the fruition of their efforts into how that manifested positively for them. Okay, so the last of these is called is just ignorance. So with ignorance, of course, ignorance has different levels to it in Buddhist teaching. There's what's called fundamental ignorance, Marigpa, which is at the root. We mentioned the three root delusions. Fundamental ignorance is one of the three root delusions: attachment, anger, and fundamental ignorance. Um, the philosophical side of that's a little bit too detailed, for this discussion. Um, but we can also say that ignorance is just on a grosser or coarser level, ignorance is just confusion, a confused mind, a state of not knowing, a state of confusion. So, of course, the Buddha would certainly say that we are in a state of confusion. We are in a state, because we talked about, all of these minds that are not balanced, all of these minds of anger, attachment, jealousy, envy, these are all unbalanced minds. And so, ignorance is really at their root, confusion, not understanding how to be balanced, not understanding how to relate um, in a comprehensive or holistic way, only kind of exaggerated, having an exaggerated way of relating to all of these things. Um, so, of course, as ordinary sentient beings, we need to understand that these afflictions, these delusions, these negative states of mind, they will arise inevitably. They're part of being an ordinary sentient being. It's not like, we are somehow particularly uh, ill-suited, because we begin to notice these arising in the mind. Um, the point is that all ordinary sentient beings deal with these afflicted states, and there are ways of responding to them where we can reduce these tendencies, these habits over time. We can um, apply antidotes to these, and we can effectively learn to deal with them once we understand that that they are problematic, and but understand also too that they can be countered effectively in our practice. Okay, so that's the list of the five negative states of mind. Are there any thoughts or questions about this list, the second list of obstacles?
Hi, Venerable.
all these um, all these afflictions have a sort of comparing mind between us and the other, but does it not also have sort of making I am, making an identity?
Yeah, so in the next so of course this class is kind of um mainly focused on the practicalities of a meditation practice, starting a meditation practice, which is can be quite broad, for what a person might be choosing, to do with that. In Buddhism, in a nutshell, we'll go a little bit more into detail about um, what you're talking, like this idea of what's called self-grasping, self-cherishing, um, kind of how these negative states of mind arise from what they call, the dualistic appearance, kind of this concretization of, as you said, like one's own ego identity, um, and how that is really, yeah, I mean, the root of all of our problems, where this idea of fundamental ignorance is misconstruing the ego and the ego identity, and how that's getting us into really all of this trouble. Um, but yeah, that's definitely at the root from the Buddhist perspective that we're also, of all of the things that we're not relating to in a balanced way, the most important is that we're not relating to our sense of ourselves in a balanced way. Um, we think that whatever arises in our mind is, the most important, and that we need to always be happy, and we need to never suffer or never experience difficulty or obstacles, um, because we also have this unbalanced way of thinking about the ego. And that way of thinking about the ego or relating to the ego identity um, is the source of why anger arises in the mind, because the mind, attachment isn't getting what it wants. The ego, we're not pleasing the ego, and so on.
But even if you didn't compare, even if you said, "Oh, I am so good, I'm so clever," it's still making an I identity out of it, yeah?
Yeah, because you could also say I'm terrible, right? Or I'm the worst, and that's also a problem, from the so yeah, any kind of over identification with our thoughts, over identification with our feelings, our thoughts, our what we think of as comprising the self. When we over identify with that, we get ourselves, yeah, into all kinds of trouble. All kinds of problems arise from that. So it doesn't necessarily mean that, we think that we're good. Yeah, I mean, just the thought I'm separate, as you're saying, just the idea of separateness, the idea. So what I would say ultimately, if a person chooses to deeply involve themselves in Buddhist, philosophy and Buddhist meditation, all of that, I would say that the point of all of that is to overcome the dualistic mind, the mind that creates separation, the mind that creates self and other, that to fundamentally overcome self-grasping and self-cherishing. Um, but I mean, that might not be what a person is choosing to do. I mean, there's certainly many other religious traditions that have the idea of some sort of intrinsic identity, like the soul. So not every, of course, not everyone is motivated to kind of look at that intrinsicness or that idea of I am, in the same way that, Buddhists, traditional Buddhists are motivated to look at it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
So we'll switch gears a little bit and talk about, again, focusing on the practicalities of what a person, what's helpful for a person to focus on in terms of setting up a practice at home, a formal meditation practice. There are, from this perspective, there are four parts of any given session of meditation to set it up in a really useful way. Um, so the first is, um, if we so I mean, it depends on how you think about it. We talked, you could say that there are five. If we go back to the first class where we talked about like the altar, having an altar, having a space. We talked a little bit about the purpose of an altar, which is, a focal point for one's practice, where the image is on the altar. It's meant to be beautiful. It's meant to move the mind, uplift the mind, to have images of holy beings, whatever that is for a person. Um, and we mentioned, that you might make offerings on the altar, offerings of flowers or fruit. We talked a little bit about water bowls, maybe setting out water bowls, using water bowls as a way of making offerings every day. So if a person has something like that, and if a person's choosing to have their practice um, be constructed in that sort of more Buddhist way, then you might start with, cleaning that space, setting out offerings, doing water bowls, lighting incense, something of that sort as a preliminary. But then if we talk about the beginning of the session itself, we start with, just kind of moving into the space. Um, so that refers to the posture that we've talked about, settling the body into the posture, and then most likely doing a few minutes of a breathing meditation to give yourself an on-ramp into your session of meditation. So that could be 9 round breathing that we talked about, ordinary breathing meditation, but giving yourself kind of a transition period into your session of meditation. And then once your mind is a little bit more settled, a little bit calmer, you've given yourself a bit of a buffer, then you motivate for that session. And this is something that's very personal, to every individual person. There's a text. If you were interested, you could go to fpmt.org. There's they have a button there called the Foundation Store. There's a text available in the Foundation Store called Daily Prayers. And in the Daily Prayers text, you will find different examples of motivations, if you were interested in looking at that. But the idea of a motivation is to think about why we're doing it. Like what actually is the point? Why do we want to have a meditation practice? Um, so the goal is to try to motivate the mind in an altruistic direction, to think in some way before every session of meditation, may whatever it is that I'm about to meditate on, may that be of benefit beyond just my own life, just my own self-interest. Of course, we know that we benefit, of course, we do benefit from having a meditation practice. It does improve our day. It improves our mood. There's all kinds of personal benefits. But we want to try to have a more expansive motivation for why we're doing it. But again, the content of that is very personal. There's no wrong way to do it. Uh, the idea is just to try to think about other sentient beings and, to think, we can think, for example, even if I'm kind of thinking, well, I would like to have more peace of mind. I would like to be more patient. I would like to be kinder, because I can see how if I am impatient, or if I'm quick to anger, I can see that that's causing me problems. That's generating suffering for myself. So of course, we may come to our practice with an understanding that I'm suffering and I wish to not suffer. And that's perfectly valid, absolutely. But we can think, though, too, what would it mean for others if I was successful in gaining that greater sense of peace of mind? If I was more patient, if I was kinder to others, if I had greater spaciousness in my mind, if I wasn't quick to anger, if I wasn't so stressed out, um, how would the people around me, by virtue of my mind being different, how would they be able to receive benefits from that? That's certainly a great way to incorporate thinking about other people. So it isn't only about oneself, but we're intentionally incorporating those around us in our motivation. And, you know, really, from the Buddhist perspective, the motivation is the most important part of the practice, because it really determines what we get out of it. It determines what the result is, for us. If our motivation is is only self-interested, then that is the only result that we will get out of that personally. We that's what we're seeking, and therefore that's what will arise. Um, a person, for example, in a slightly different context, right? A person might hear about a teaching that's happening, some religious, spiritual teaching that's happening in their town. Um, and they may go to that because they want to impress someone at work or in their personal lives um, who's affiliated with whatever spiritual, could be something that we're not that interested in, or and so we go thinking, oh, I just want to hear some facts, or I want to be able to repeat some sentences that this spiritual teacher says to my friend so that they will be impressed that I went and did this thing. Um, so our mind is completely blocked from any kind of benefit that we might get from going to that teaching. That person might be talking about compassion, loving kindness, generosity, might be giving all kinds of amazing, but we're just there with our pen and our paper trying to jot down a couple sentences that we can repeat to our friend at work. So we're totally blocked, closed off from receiving any kind of real benefit from our time going to that, having that experience. Whereas if we had a really open mind, a really, expansive mind that was like, I just want to, whatever they can tell me that might be able to help me be a better person, you know, then I can take that on board. I can try it out. I can experiment with it. I can see how that goes, and see what happens based on taking that on board and really working with it in a really open-hearted way. What a person will get out of, and it's the same person, they're going to see the same teaching. The other person is going to say the exact same things, but how the impact on that person's life could be incredibly vastly different depending on their motivation for why they are doing it. Um, so we might do a very, very simple meditation, but if our motivation is profound, if our motivation is expansive, um, then even though the meditation, the actual, you know, object of our meditation might have been quite simple, the benefit, is correlated to the breadth and the depth of our of our motivation. So we should really we shouldn't overlook it or kind of gloss over it or, just kind of rush through it or not think about it, not really give it a lot of our energy, our effort, because it's of all of the things that we're going to do, it's the most important, is really motivating well. And then we have what's called the actual meditation. So we've done a little bit of breathing, at the very beginning to give ourselves that on ramp. But then generally from this tradition, the actual meditation more often than not will be analytical in nature. So again, could be a meditation on impermanence, could be a meditation on loving kindness or compassion or generosity, or trying to learn something about karma. I mean, all kinds, dozens of different topics, and in a completely different philosophical context. Could be a verse from a different religious tradition, that a person is trying to understand or trying to embody. All kinds of hundreds of different potential options for what a person. But the idea, of course, from we've defined meditation as the process of becoming more and more familiar with a virtuous object. So, whatever it is that we're trying to familiarize our mind with should be intrinsically virtuous in its nature. It shouldn't be, we shouldn't be intentionally thinking about how to get back at someone or something that's not inherently beneficial to the mind. But there's hundreds of potential objects. And so, of course, that could be 5 minutes. Once we get to this point, could be we're going to spend 5 minutes or 10 minutes or 15 minutes um, contemplating this topic, whatever it might be, whatever we're choosing. um, there's many, many books that can give a person ideas for um, choosing objects. There's a book called How to Meditate by Kathleen MacDonald that has a number of um, potential topics that a person could use. She wrote another book called Awakening the Kind Heart that will also give you many options. Um, if a person was interested in more kind of formal, maybe not formal, but more structured practice, if a person feels like they are ready for a more structured, particularly Tibetan Buddhist practice, then for that person, the main focus of a meditation practice is often on what's called the Lam Rim, or the stages of the path to enlightenment. And that is what we'll go into starting next week. We will use the Lam Rim to focus our classes in Buddhism in a nutshell. But the Lam Rim, I think maybe I've said a few sentences. I'm not sure about it in this class. The Lam Rim is a later effort by great masters who came, really about 1,000 years plus after the Buddha came, and they looked at all of his teachings and they tried to organize it and systematize it for ordinary people who didn't have the time, the energy to go through all of the sutra material. They really did all of that hard work for us, and they organized it into these much later texts that have organized the sutra material. So that's really the heart of Tibetan Buddhist meditation practice. If a person, again, if they feel like that's what they're interested in. So Kathleen MacDonald does also have a book on meditating on the stages of the path. Um, so that's an option. And then, of course, there are many different Lamrim texts that a person can study and read and so on. But really, that's for a Tibetan Buddhist practitioner who feels like they would like a structured practice, moving toward a Lamrim practice is really what is done more so than anything else. And then the last step of the stages of a session of meditation is what's called dedication practice. So this is the last thing that a person does. And this is also considered to be extremely important from the Tibetan Buddhist perspective. Um, it serves a few different purposes, but like the motivation, was meant to help us to frame our practice in the context of others. Dedication practice is reinforcing that. So when we motivated, we hadn't yet meditated, right? We were thinking about why am I about to meditate? And then we meditated. And now we are thinking about what do I want to be the results of what I just did? I just meditated, and what do I want to flow from that? What are the effects that I would like to have that bring about in myself and for others? How do I? So, in a general sense, what we could say is we know that what we just did was to familiarize our mind with a virtuous object, right? So before we did it, our mind was less familiar with the virtuous object than it is now. Our mind is now a little bit more familiar with that virtuous object than it was half an hour ago. So, what do I want to get out of having done that? So, here again, we are encouraged to dedicate in really expansive ways because we're thinking about this one session of meditation as being part of a larger spiritual goal, right? We're meditating hopefully on a regular basis and maybe getting more and more regular over time. Perfectly fine if we're starting like, one day a week and, with the goal of 2 days a week and so on, over the course of months and a year, 2 years. But you know, it's a habit that we're trying to cultivate. So this one session is just a tiny piece of this overall process. And where do I want that process to end up? What do I want to be the end result of all of this mass of energy and effort that I'm putting into my practice? So again, that text that I mentioned, Daily Prayers, that's on the Foundation store in fpmt.org, there will be examples there too of ways of dedicating. But again, like I said, it's very personal, so there's no wrong way to do it. But we shouldn't shy away from, again, also doing it in a really expansive way, like thinking about, may all suffering be completely eliminated, from from the positive energy that I've developed in this session of meditation. Really having this kind of extremely fantastical approach, right? Because it's the mind, right? It's the energy of the mind, and the mind is non-physical. The mind isn't constrained in the same way that the body is constrained. So we can really think big. We can think about, whatever incredible positive results we would like to have, and think that, whatever I did in this, may it bring this result. And again, making sure that we're bringing other people into that. And the fact that we bring other people into it also helps us to not have our practice co-opted again by pridefulness, because we think, oh, I didn't do this for myself, I did this for others, I gave, in a way, it's kind of like not holding on to what we've done. It's giving it away. It's taking whatever we've done and offering it for others, more so than even oneself, which is an antidote to deluded pride, antidote to, because our practice can puff up the mind. It can be co-opted by deluded pride, and it can kind of make us arrogant, or increase separation between ourselves and others. And dedication is a really useful way of just, thinking everything that happened, may it ripen, for other people, may it ease their burdens and so on. But how you want to think about that, what you, or maybe, write down different paragraphs of things, and, it's all completely individual in how a person uh, would like to go about that. Okay, so those are the 4 or 5 um, parts of any given session of meditation. So again, I'll pause. Any thoughts or questions? Nope. All right. So let's end today by talking a little bit about, and then ending with a meditation um, that incorporates visualization. You will find, if you pursue Tibetan Buddhism um, to any degree, you'll find that it's extremely common that various meditations involve visualization, involve imagining things that are quite visual in nature. So, of course, meditation is something that we're doing with the mind. Um, so this is in our imagination, right? We may use a physical support for a visualization. You'll find particularly that it's one thing that's very common for people to visualize are the forms of enlightened beings. It's very, very common that you find people visualizing the historical Buddha, visualizing other Buddhas, other, enlightened beings. Um, and the purpose of doing that is that it's kind of an alternative way of developing positive qualities. So, for example, there's a Buddha, an enlightened being that you may have heard of, um, Chenrezig, or Avalokiteshvara, the Buddha of compassion, right? And or also Tara. You may have heard of Tara. Um, there's different forms of Tara. There's green Tara, white Tara, etc. Green Tara is visualized as green, obviously. Tara is associated, so all of these forms are associated with aspects of enlightened mind, enlightened activity. Chenrezig, as I said, is called the Buddha of compassion. Um, Tara, green Tara, is associated with the overcoming of obstacles or fears or challenges. Um, so, for example, Tara, one part of when Tara is visualized, she's visualized in meditation, um, but she's visualized as having one foot, one leg kind of outstretched and one leg kind of in meditation posture. So it's as if she's rising up from meditation. She's sort of leaping into action for the benefit of sentient beings. Because I said that she is associated, her energy is associated with overcoming challenges, overcoming difficulties, kind of that active, um, kind of like leaping into a burning building kind of energy, right? So just by visualizing that form where that frozen kind of intention is embodied, it it generates in our own mind that kind of courageousness, right? That kind of we ourselves take on that aspect of leaping into action, rising up and actually tackling problems that we're facing. One of the forms of Avalokiteshvara or Chenrezig, same enlightened being, just Sanskrit or Tibetan language. Um, One form is called the thousand armed Chenrezig, right? Where there's literally this enlightened form literally has 1,000 different arms, and at the palm of each hand, at the end of every arm, is an eye. And so simultaneously, Avalokiteshvara can look in 1,000 different directions, because there's an eye, right, in the palm of 1,000 different arms. And so Chenrezig is looking in 1,000 directions all at once, all of the time, for suffering sentient beings to benefit. Um, so if we imagine, like, what must that be like, what that manifestation is like, just by visualizing it, we ourselves can get a flavor or a taste of that kind of energy. Like what would it be like to be able to look in 1,000 different directions simultaneously to see who needs help, to see who can I benefit. Um, and there's many, many other ways of that visualization is integrated in a whole variety of Tibetan Buddhist meditations. It's extremely common to find that different practices that you might come across will find ways of um, integrating visualization. And, I'm not sure exactly, it could be if you, I mean, if you think about it from a kind of neurological perspective, it's certainly true that human beings Like the visual cortex of a human being is the same in the brain. It's the same thing that gets activated when we imagine. Um, and it's hugely important in the processing of information. Um, and so it plays a really impactful role in how we construct our world and how we navigate our world. So it could be, I mean, in a way, it could be tapping into the fact that that's true, about how people, often kind of construct and navigate their world, because the neuroscientists will tell you that there's no real difference between the way that the brain perceives an actual visual form and a detailed, imagined, visual form. So it's a very kind of immediate way of connecting, connecting the mind. Of course, Buddhism would, of course, say that the mind and the brain are deeply interconnected, but still separate phenomena. But still there is that interconnection, and we know that that the mind depends upon the functioning of the brain to be expressed, and that if the brain is damaged, the expression of the mind is similarly impaired. So Buddhism doesn't disagree with that deep interdependence, interconnection, but it does, of course, present the idea that the brain and the mind are themselves separate entities, separate phenomena. Uh, so it is something that you will come across again and again, with regard to Tibetan Buddhist meditations. So we'll do kind of a simple version of a visualization meditation to end our class. Are there any questions, thoughts, or questions before we do that? Okay. So we will just situate ourselves in a stable, upright, comfortable position. And we'll begin to focus our attention on the breath, moving our awareness away from whatever's happening in our space, letting go of thoughts of the past, plans for the future, just focusing our awareness on the breath, whatever physical sensations are naturally accompanying the in-breath and the out-breath in the space around the opening of the nostrils. So breathing naturally, breathing normally, and just closely attending to whatever sensations we can perceive that are accompanying the in-breath and the out-breath. And we give ourselves the instruction to notice when the mind has moved away from the intended object, the breath. And when we notice the arising of distraction, we simply lift our awareness up from that distraction and we place it again and again on the breath without judgment, without frustration, recognizing that the arising of distraction is completely normal. For a few minutes, we'll just quiet the mind. And then begin to imagine that with each exhalation, that whatever tendencies and habits that you have that you feel like aren't beneficial, aren't aligned with your spiritual interests, goals, creating obstacles for yourself, that these are leaving the body and mind in the form of a smoke or pollution being dispelled from the body and mind through the nostrils each time you exhale. And just continuing to breathe normally and naturally, not visualizing in this way. And now begin to think of the qualities, the tendencies, the states of mind that you wish to embody more and more. And imagine these qualities, states of mind, habits, as if they were a brilliant white light surrounding oneself. And imagine on each inhalation, you breathe in those qualities, states of mind that support your spiritual goals. I think with each cycle of inhalation and exhalation, you're letting go of that which you feel like isn't serving you, and you're embracing that which you wish to develop, to expand, to cultivate. And so your body and mind is pervaded more and more by all of these positive qualities. And the body and mind become more and more relaxed, more and more light and blissful. Just continue visualizing in that way. And then when you're ready, we'll come back together. All right. So we will end on that note. But if there are any questions that would be helpful to address, I'm happy to do that. Seems like there aren't. So, yeah, if you want to join the Buddhism in a Nutshell, that starts next week on the 1st of July. But otherwise, have a great night. Thanks for coming.